When we hear the word knight, most of us picture gleaming armor, noble steeds, and chivalric gallantry. It's easy to envision a hero in shining plate, rescuing damsels in distress and defending the weak. Yet behind this romantic image lies a more complex, often brutal reality. Knights who fought on medieval battlefields experienced mud, blood, and unrelenting violence, hardly the stuff of fairy tales. Tonight, let's peel back the layers of legend and examine the true nature of knighthood in the Middle Ages. We'll explore how popular culture and medieval propaganda shaped heroic myths, then contrast them with first-hand accounts of warfare, cruelty, and survival. Can we hold onto the ideals of courage and honor while acknowledging the harsh truths behind them? In modern films or history books aimed at general audiences, a knight's life often begins with an idyllic training montage. Young squires riding horses across green fields, practicing lance drills in a sunlit clearing. By comparison, a medieval chronicle describes the fetid stench of a battlefield riddled with bodies and guts, the shrieks of wounded men echoing across the morass of churned earth. For example, a popular Hollywood depiction might show a knight raising his sword high on a grass-covered hill, rallying troops under a banner of goodness. But in 1250, Jean de Joinville, a squire who accompanied King Louis IX on the Seventh Crusade, wrote of Mansoura in Egypt. The field was strewn with corpses and the river ran red with blood. One saw headless bodies and limbless trunks littered everywhere, and the stench was so overpowering that one could hardly breathe. Those two scenes, cinematic heroics versus Joinville's horror, capture our dilemma. The knight as a symbol of honor and the knight as a warrior immersed in brutality. Why does the myth of the noble knight endure? Partly because medieval society itself propagated that image. In the 12th century, troubadours and bards celebrated courtly love and valor in epic verses. Knights commissioned poets to narrate their deeds, casting them as paragons of virtue. Take William Marshall, later Regent of England. His contemporaries wrote glowing chronicles celebrating his unwavering loyalty to 5 English kings and his prowess on the battlefield. Yet tucked into those same chronicles are references to Marshall's role in besieging castles, ordering hangings, and overseeing brutal operations to starve enemies into surrender. How do we reconcile the Marshall we read about in chivalric verse, ever faithful, ever just, with the Marshall who laid waste to towns and commanded executions? On one hand, knights were expected to embody chivalric ideals: bravery in battle, loyalty to one's lord, courtesy toward ladies, and protection of the weak. That code of conduct, partly drawn from Christian virtue, offered a moral framework meant to temper the violence of feudal society. On the other hand, medieval warfare was a brutal business. A mounted charge could crush a man to paste within seconds. Siege camps bred disease that felled hundreds. Even the most valiant knight risked a gruesome, agonizing death from a shattered bone infection. No antibiotic could save him. Consider the anonymous French knight at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, who later described how arrows fell as thick as snow, felling horses and sending armored riders crashing into the mud, their legs pinned beneath their mounts. Holding on to an ideal of honor proved difficult when every battle felt like a savage lottery of life and death. How should an American listener in our 21st century world view these medieval warriors? In America, we admire individual courage. Whether on a sports field or a battlefield, we celebrate those who risk all for a cause. Yet we also condemn war's brutality. In the same way that a soldier today might receive a medal for valor yet come home carrying psychological scars, medieval knights balanced public acclaim with private trauma. A squire entering knighthood at age 21 might have already seen dozens of battles. Some chroniclers note that many knights never slept more than a few nights at a time after witnessing the screams of their comrades hacked down around them. So our dilemma remains. Can we admire the knight's commitment to duty and bravery without glossing over the horror of medieval combat? Before we delve deeper, let's consider how simple tales of romance took hold in an age racked by conflict. The Arthurian legends, stories of King Arthur, Lancelot, and the quest for the Holy Grail began to coalesce in 12th century French chivalric romances. These tales painted knights as paragons of moral perfection, able to conquer dragons, rescue maidens, and maintain honor even amid temptation. It's no coincidence that courts across Europe adopted these stories to define their own ideals. Yet real knights often owed allegiance to petty lords who demanded oppressive taxes, seized farmland, or abused villagers. A chronicler in England around 1200 lamented the plight of peasants forced to serve a knight's retinue. They toiled from dawn to dusk, their children starved, and their lands lay barren, all so that a handful of mounted men might feast and joust in courtly pageants. Here's a modern parallel. Imagine a professional athlete who does charity work and fans praise as a role model. Yet behind closed doors, that same athlete might engage in unsavory behavior, drinking excessively or exploiting fans. We idolize the trophy-winning moments but ignore the off-field controversies. Similarly, medieval chroniclers and later historians often highlighted knights' most noble deeds, charitable gifts to monasteries, chivalric tournaments, while downplaying the extortion, pillaging, and torture that many inflicted. As we move forward, keep in mind that knights existed in two eras at once: the era of legend and the era of unflinching brutality. We're now ready to unpack how feudal society turned young boys, often as young as 7, into elite warriors. These were not gentle youths' first foray into friendly fencing. Instead, they scrubbed floors, tended horses, and prepared weapons in grimy castle dungeons. As squires, they carried their master's lance into battle, fetched fresh horses for fallen knights, and hoisted wounded men from the mud. Their training was as much about moral conditioning, learning to confess sins, attend mass, practice prayer, as it was about swordplay. Often, a late 13th century squire would accompany his lord on every campaign, waking before dawn to polish armor and ending the day in prayer for forgiveness. But in truth, few squires escaped physical harm. Many died before ever reaching knighthood. The stark reality: idealistic codes of conduct existed side by side with everyday violence. When a squire finally received the accolade of knighthood, usually on the eve of his first battle, it required standing vigil all night, fasting and praying in a small chapel. At dawn, his lord tapped him on the shoulders thrice with a sword's flat edge. That brief ceremony marked his transition from a servitor to an armed warrior in his own right. Yet mere hours later, he might find himself in the chaos of battle, confused by the press of men and horses, arrows whistling overhead. A knight's first fight tested both his training and his nerves. Some legends tell of knights who greeted combat gleefully, hearts racing for glory, but eyewitness accounts record newcomers screaming at the sight of dismembered bodies. The lesson: initiation ceremonies and chivalric vows meant little once steel struck steel and the ground ran slick with blood. Let's pause here and draw a brief lesson from this contrast. In any field, sports, business, or life itself, we often hear that character and ideals will carry us through. A promising young leader might be taught to uphold integrity, courage, and teamwork. Yet real work environments demand compromises, tough decisions, and sometimes ethically gray choices. Understanding that discrepancy doesn't mean abandoning ideals. Rather, it means recognizing the gap between aspiration and reality. Similarly, if we admire medieval knights for their valor or their model of loyalty, we should also accept that they, like us, had to navigate grim circumstances. Acknowledging their humanity in all its complexity deepens our appreciation for what they accomplished, rather than diminishing it. As we transition to the next section, where we'll explore how knights armed themselves for this violent world, keep in mind the tension between aspiration and hard truth. The pageantry of tournaments, with heralds announcing challengers and ladies bestowing favors, did not eliminate the fact that each contest could end in broken bones or death. Similarly, a knight's gleaming armor concealed body wounds festering with infection. Our next conversation will explain how plate and chainmail evolved, how weapon designs traded off speed for power, and how the warhorse was as much a weapon as the knight himself. In that discussion, we'll see how a romantic ideal, invincible steel protecting virtuous men, juxtaposed with the cold reality of medieval economics and logistics. How could a warrior sustain hope of honor when every piece of equipment increased vulnerability in subtle ways? When we think of medieval knights, it's tempting to imagine them as solitary heroes, riding forth from castle to castle on quests of lofty purpose. Yet knights did not spring up fully formed on gallant steeds. Their emergence was the product of a social system that, in many ways, defined medieval Europe, the feudal order. Underpinning every banner, every coat of arms, and every oath of fealty lay a web of obligations and landholdings stretching back to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. This system shaped who became a knight, why they fought, and how they were rewarded. By understanding feudal foundations, we can see that knighthood was more than a matter of skill with a sword. It was inseparably bound to land, loyalty, and social hierarchy. Following the fall of Rome in the 5th century, Western Europe fragmented into competing kingdoms, principalities, and tribal confederations. Cities shrank, trade routes dissolved, and centralized authority vanished. In this power vacuum, local warlords rose to prominence by riding out to protect or plunder neighboring territories. Over time, landowners discovered a simple bargain. In exchange for military service, aspiring warriors could hold land or fiefs granted by a more powerful lord. This arrangement both secured armies for a lord and offered social mobility if one could secure a grant of land. Thus, the very concept of a knight emerged. A mounted warrior who swore loyalty to a lord, wielded arms on his behalf, and in return received a patch of land or income. In this way, the knightly class was born not merely from individual valor, but from a societal bargain between two eras: an era of heroic individualism, holding the line against invaders, and an era of structured land-based hierarchy, the feudal system. By the 11th century, feudalism had crystallized in places like Normandy and Anjou. William the Conqueror's 1066 invasion of England illustrates this perfectly. After defeating King Harold at Hastings, William faced the challenge of rewarding his Norman vassals while retaining control over England. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, records how William parceled England into hundreds of feudal estates, granting each to his most loyal knights and barons. Nigel d'Aubigny, for instance, received lands in Bedfordshire and Northamptonshire for his service at Hastings. These grants ensured that vassals remained bound to William through oaths of homage. Nigel swore to fight alongside the Duke, to provide a fixed number of knights for military campaigns, and to render counsel in the ducal court. In turn, Nigel's tenants, knight vassals below him, swore allegiance to Nigel rather than to William directly. This multilayered structure tied warrior obligations to actual parcels of land, creating a cascade of commitments. The knight as individual hero gave way to the knight as a cog in a broader social machine, reliant on land revenues to equip himself and his household. Feudal relationships took the form of a pyramid. At its apex sat the king, the ultimate overlord, said to hold all land by divine right. Below him, dukes and earls controlled vast duchies or counties. Beneath these magnates, knights received smaller fiefs, sometimes as modest as a few hundred acres, known as knight's fees. A knight's fee supported one knight's lifestyle: armor, weapons, warhorse, and household. In England, a typical knight's fee produced about £20 of annual income, roughly equivalent to enough to maintain a small retinue of men-at-arms and squires. Tenants-in-chief, barons who held directly from the king, protected the king's realm by mustering a specified number of knights for royal campaigns. In two eras, one of fragmented power and one of centralized obligation, the knight's role was to be both warfighter and local lord. He occupied territory yet also answered to a higher feudal lord in matters of war, justice, and counsel. Consider the case of Hugh de Lacy, an Anglo-Norman baron in the late 12th century. After Henry II granted him expansive lands in Ireland, Hugh was obliged to contribute a certain number of knights to the royal army. In turn, Hugh parceled out portions of his Irish holdings to knights who served him personally. These knights, bound to Hugh by oaths, provided military service when summoned. Yet they also administered justice on Hugh's behalf, collected rents from peasants, and kept local fortifications, motte and bailey castles or early stone keeps, garrisoned. In this layered hierarchy, Hugh's knights were local lords responsible for both defense and daily governance. Their authority extended beyond the battlefield. In times of peace, they settled disputes, enforced labor obligations, and oversaw agricultural production. A knight was simultaneously a warrior sworn to fight in wars and a minor magnate presiding over peasant serfs. What about the peasants who toiled the land? Most of the English countryside was organized into manors, where peasants, serfs, or villeins farmed strips of land in open fields. They owed the knight a share of their crop, perhaps a tenth of their barley or wheat, and incurred labor dues, like working 3 days a week in the knight's domain, directly controlled land. In return, the knight provided protection, defending villagers from raids, maintaining a minimal presence of law and order, and, in times of conflict, offering refuge within the castle's walls. However, this sounds more benevolent than it often was. A peasant might suffer crushing taxes to support his knight's warhorse, pay fines for missing labor, or face forced conscription into the knight's retinue as camp followers. The ideal of a knight as a protector of the weak coexisted uneasily with the reality of exploitation. Peasants bound by customary obligations that could be arbitrarily increased. Across continental Europe, feudal patterns varied. In the Holy Roman Empire, for instance, emperors often contended with powerful dukes, bishops, and city-state elites. Imperial knights held lands from regional princes or ecclesiastical lords, rather than directly from the emperor. These knightly estates, sometimes perched on hilltop castles in southern Germany or along the Rhine, functioned semi-autonomously. The Prince Archbishop of Salzburg might demand service from knights in his domain, but those same knights could refuse to serve the emperor's army without explicit permission. In southern France, Occitan knightly families like the Trencavels rose to local prominence. They exercised near-sovereign power within their viscounties, raising armies of men-at-arms and negotiating marriages to solidify alliances. Regional customs governed their obligations, often codified in written charters by the 12th century. Though the broad model of land for service was universal, local legal traditions and power dynamics produced a range of knightly experiences, from fiercely independent lords to tightly controlled vassals. Back in England, the capstone of this feudal edifice was the King's Court, held periodically by writ in various locations, London, Westminster, or even itinerant royal palaces like Woodstock. Whenever summoned by royal writ, every tenant-in-chief had to appear, bringing their knights as well. Failure to attend meant forfeiture of lands or hefty fines. This served two purposes. It let the king audit his magnates, settle disputes among nobles, and raise finances through scutage, money paid in lieu of military service. If a baron owed 50 knights and only brought 40, he paid a set fee for the missing 10. These funds, in turn, paid mercenaries or financed castles. The knight's identity could be measured in military obligation, the number of days served and number of knights provided, and in financial capacity, whether one could afford to supply arms for a knight's retinue. Their status wasn't just personal valor. It was visible on account rolls and muster rolls. The feudal foundation also influenced how knights viewed their loyalties. A knight who held land under multiple lords faced a dilemma: which banner to follow if two overlords went to war against each other. For example, Robert Bruce of Annandale in early 13th century Scotland held estates from both the Scottish king and the Earl of Fife. When disputes arose, Bruce had to carefully navigate relationships, sometimes serving in one overlord's army while paying scutage to the other. These complex webs of allegiance illustrate that loyalty in the feudal era was seldom absolute. The knight's famous oath, "I will be loyal, true, and steadfast," carried layers of nuance. Loyalties to local lords, obligations to overlords, and spiritual commitment to church and God. Reconciling those obligations demanded diplomatic acumen as much as martial skill. By the mid-12th century, knights had become crucial pillars of royal authority, both as enforcers and as respected peers. King Henry II of England exemplified how a monarch could leverage knights to extend his influence. When Henry inherited vast territories in France, the Angevin Empire, he relied on counts, barons, and their knightly retinues to occupy and govern. Knights were castle commanders, sheriffs, and itinerant justices. Simon de Montfort, later Earl of Leicester, began his career as a knight serving Henry III in Gascony. By raising knights for royal campaigns, he forged both military reputations and political alliances. Feudalism wasn't static. It evolved as kings learned to centralize power, turning knights into instruments of royal government, even as those same knights retained local autonomy over their manors. As a moment of reflection, Let's draw a short lesson from these feudal foundations. In any organization, corporate or civic, structural incentives determine how individuals behave. A modern company might offer stock options to employees in exchange for loyalty. Similarly, feudal lords offered land for military service. But just as stock options can motivate employees to prioritize short-term gains over long-term stability, feudal grants could lead knights to focus on local interests, raising a retinue for raids, resisting royal directives, or exploiting peasant tenants, rather than serving broader societal goals. Understanding the underlying incentives helps us see why some knights upheld justice while others became warlords. Whenever systems are built on personal loyalties and economic compacts, individual motivations may align with collective needs or directly oppose them. Now that we've traced how knights emerged from the feudal order, rooted in land grants, oaths, and overlapping loyalties, let's prepare to see what it took to climb that ladder from page to squire to full-fledged knight. In our next section, we'll explore the rigorous training they underwent, both physically and morally. We'll meet young boys sent away at age 7 to learn manners in Latin, and see how squires spent years perfecting horsemanship, swordplay, and battlefield tactics. This training was not just about wielding a lance. It was about instilling discipline, chivalric values, and an understanding of obligations to lord, vassal, and god. The feudal system defined who could become a knight. Training opened the door, but only if one's family or patron could provide land and income. In our next conversation, we'll see how that door opened for dozens of young nobles each year, shaping the warrior class that dominated medieval Europe. In the Middle Ages, the journey from childhood to knighthood was as structured as it was perilous. Imagine a vast castle courtyard, where a handful of squires trained under the gaze of seasoned knights, and younger pages scurry about with errands and wooden practice swords. For a boy of noble birth, the moment he turned 7, his life shifted from family hearth to household service. He left home to become a page, a role that sounds gentle but was, in reality, an apprenticeship for the harsh world of medieval warfare. In one era, children played carefree games. In the other, young pages already balanced mortar for the castle walls, polished boots, and whispered their first prayers in the keep's chapel. As a page, a boy's days began before dawn. He learned basic literacy, often in Latin, while fetching water for his lord's table or sweeping hearths. He assisted at feasts, handing goblets of wine to guests and folding the lord's surcoat after meals. Yet amidst these chores, he observed the conduct expected of a future knight: reverence during mass, deference when a knight entered the hall, and courtesy toward ladies at court. The noble world taught both courtesy and discipline through simple tasks: leading the warhorse to pasture, carrying messages to the stables, or kneeling before the lady of the house to learn proper etiquette. In one era, children were seen as small adults. In the other, they were shaped into instruments of war. Consider the case of Sir Geoffrey of Anjou, who became a page at age 7 in the early 12th century. Contemporary records show him delivering messages for his lord, Robert of Gloucester, and observing his first joust as a spectator, eyes wide with awe as armored horses thundered toward one another. Even then, Geoffrey's heart pounded not just at the spectacle, but at the sudden realization that such glory came at the cost of blood and broken bones. In this way, the earliest seeds of knighthood were sown: curiosity and admiration, tempered by fear and an early understanding of mortality. After several years as a page, commonly until the age of 14, a boy graduated to the title of squire. This transition marked a deeper immersion into warfare. Squires trained directly under a knight, literally carrying his master's shield and weapons into battle. One era's playful mimicry gave way to another era's serious preparation. Mixing chalk to draw tactical diagrams, learning to mount and dismount a warhorse, and practicing with wooden lances that weighed as much as a full-grown man. Each day, squires spent hours wrestling in the yard to build strength, studied the piercing angle of arrows, and learned to recognize various enemy banners. It was a relentless regimen designed to toughen body and mind alike. The story of William Marshall offers a vivid example of this squire's world. Born in 1147, William entered the household of William de Tancarville around age 17. As de Tancarville's squire, William's duties included cleaning his knight's armor until it shone like a mirror and caring for the destrier, an enormous warhorse bred for strength. When battle loomed, he followed his master onto the field, attending to injuries and retrieving fresh steeds for fallen knights. Later chronicles praise William's endurance, noting how his muscles were honed by months of carrying chainmail and swords weighing upward of 50 pounds. In that era, young squires like William faced days filled with toil. In another era, they witnessed the glory only after understanding its costs. Beyond physical training, squires received instruction in reading and writing, so they could comprehend orders and treaties. Heraldic manuals taught them to identify friend from foe by crests and shield designs, vital when battle lines blurred into chaos. They also studied the Code of Chivalry, excerpts from The Order of Chivalry by Ramon Llull or Tales of Charlemagne's Paladins. These readings introduced ideals of honor, loyalty, and courtesy, yet could not fully mask the brutal reality awaiting them. In one era, literature elevated knighthood to a near-mythic status. In the other, squires learned that virtue alone would not protect them from an arrow's flight or a mace's crushing blow. Real-life practice often outpaced theory. When a squire accompanied his knight on campaign, he faced the same hardships of war. Freezing nights in tent encampments, barely edible rations of hardtack and water, and the stench of decaying bodies strewn across the battlefield. They dragged wounded comrades from the field, tended to gruesome injuries without anesthesia, and encountered the despair of captured prisoners facing ransom or execution. One Crusader squire recounted how, after the siege of Acre in 1191, he spent days collecting rocks to reinforce castle walls, his hands raw and bleeding, all while rats gnawed at fallen corpses in the flickering torchlight. Such scenes propelled squires to appreciate that knighthood meant more than splendor in tournaments. It meant surviving on scant resources, confronting death, and making split-second decisions that could mean life or death. Through years of such service, a squire earned his knightly spurs. Typically, around age 21, a squire might be ceremonially dubbed. This ritual, often called the accolade, involved a night spent in prayer, fasting, and vigil in a chapel. At dawn, his lord tapped him lightly on the shoulders with the flat of a sword, saying, "Arise, Sir Knight." The simplicity of this ceremony concealed its gravity. It signified that the newly minted knight now bore the responsibility to lead men into death. His former tasks, cleaning armor, carrying the shield, were replaced by calling the charges, directing men-at-arms, and making life-or-death commands. In one era, knighthood was a rite of passage. In another, it was a mantle of mortal burden. Take the knighting of Sir John de Burgh around 1303. As chronicled by an English monk, John spent the eve of his knighting in a candlelit chamber, confessing sins to the castle chaplain and praying for divine protection. At dawn, in front of his family and the assembled garrison, his lord lifted a sword and tapped him 3 times on the left shoulder, then on the right. Immediately afterward, John joined his new peers in applying last-minute touches to his surcoat and reins. For that very morning he would be thrust into a raid against a nearby Welsh stronghold. Instead of celebrating, John raced to saddle his destrier and march alongside veteran knights, proof that knighthood offered little respite from the relentless demands of war. By the time a young noble became a knight, he had invested over a decade of his life in training. Few medieval men reached this point. High infant mortality rates and the dangers of squireship claimed many before knighthood. In England, a 14th century muster roll suggests that for every 3 knights listed, perhaps another 4 had died as squires. Those who survived often entered a battlefield already seasoned by scars, physical and psychological, that would accompany them for life. In one era, becoming a knight unlocked prestige and land. In the other, it guaranteed exposure to violence that few could escape unscathed. Once knighted, a young warrior expected to sustain his newly acquired status. That meant acquiring a warhorse, at least 1 full suit of armor, and a retinue of squires, men-at-arms, and camp followers. The costs, perhaps the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars in today's terms, fell on him or his family. As a result, a newly knighted noble often began indebted, pawning estates or turning to mercenary work to fund his equipment. This financial pressure sometimes led knights to raid their neighbors, labeled freebooters or bandits by contemporaries, or to offer their swords as condottieri to foreign princes. In one era, knighthood promised security. In another, it threatened economic ruin. Despite the hardships, knights embodied ideals that resonated across medieval society. To many peasants, seeing a knight ride into town symbolized protection against marauding bands of mercenaries or rival lords. Some knights genuinely fulfilled that role, enforcing fair justice, settling disputes peacefully, and offering alms to the poor. The story of Sir Gawain in the 14th century, though steeped in legend, has roots in real knights known for walking barefoot on pilgrimage to shrines, wearing fine armor in battle but showing mercy to vanquished foes. In one era, knights were romanticized as paragon protectors. In another, they walked a fine line between benevolent lord and brutal warrior. At this juncture, let's draw a brief lesson from the squire's path to knighthood. Whether in medieval times or modern professional settings, training phases serve to instill values, technical skills, and discipline. Yet there's always tension between idealized instruction and harsh realities encountered on the job. A young recruit in any profession may absorb codes of conduct, ethics training, corporate values, or best practices, only to confront situations where those ideals collide with crises or moral ambiguity. Recognizing this discrepancy allows individuals to better integrate principles with practice, rather than becoming disillusioned when theory meets reality. As we wrap up our exploration of pages and squires, notice how each stage, pagehood and squireship, wove together moral education, skill building, and a gradual immersion into violence. By age 21, a knight was physically capable, morally instructed, at least in theory, and psychologically primed for the battlefield. Yet he carried with him memories of early mornings cleaning boots and late nights tending arrow loops, a daily reminder that the glamour of knighthood rested on a foundation of toil and obedience. Now that we've seen how a boy transformed into a fully equipped knight, honed by years of service, study, and hardship, our next step is to examine the tools of his trade. In our following section, we'll dive into the evolution of armor and weaponry, from the simplicity of chainmail to the complexity of full plate, from the humble arming sword to massive battle axes. We'll explore how these implements shaped the knight's identity, both as a warrior and as a symbol of feudal authority. In one era, armor was seen as near invincible. In another, it represented a knight's economic burden, a literal and figurative weight he had to carry. With that in mind, join us next as we don steel and lift lances to understand how knights armed themselves for medieval warfare. When we picture a medieval knight, the first image that likely springs to mind is gleaming steel, an imposing helmet, a sturdy breastplate, and gauntlets glinting in the sun. Yet behind that iconic armor lay centuries of technological innovation, economic burden, and logistical complexity. In one era, armor symbolized near invincibility. In the other, it represented a knight's crippling debt. Let's explore how chainmail gave way to plate, how swords and lances evolved, and why the warhorse was as crucial as the man who rode it. In the early Middle Ages, chainmail, rows of interlocking iron rings, served as the knight's primary defense. A mail hauberk, reaching mid-thigh with long sleeves, offered flexibility and decent protection against slashing blows. Imagine a 12th century French knight patrolling his lord's domain at dusk. The mail swayed with each step, clinking softly, but offered little resistance to a heavy mace or well-placed axe blow. Over time, ambitious armorers began adding iron plates over critical areas, chest, shoulders, head, giving birth to mixed mail and plate armor by the 13th century. By the 14th century, full plate armor had emerged, wrapping a knight from neck to toe in steel. In one era, mail allowed movement. In the other, plate offered unparalleled defense at the cost of mobility. Consider Edward, the Black Prince, who fought at Crécy in 1346 wearing early transitional plate. His armor consisted of a mail hauberk with steel plates riveted over the torso and limbs. Since the English longbowmen at Crécy unleashed arrows on charging French knights, Edward's partial plate likely saved him from lethal wounds, even as horses fell all around him. Yet that armor weighed roughly 80 pounds, forcing him to wrestle his horse through churned mud. In one era, he epitomized knightly resilience. In another, he risked being pinned beneath his own plate. How much did such armor cost? In mid-14th century England, a basic male hauberk might cost £2 to £3 sterling, roughly equivalent to a skilled craftsman's annual wage. Full plate armor, brought to a high polish, could run £20 to £25 sterling, the price of a small manor. To put that in perspective, a knight pledging service to his liege expected to equip himself fully. Many borrowed funds, mortgaged lands, or eked out payments over years. In one era, armor represented honor. In the other, it represented near financial ruin. Beyond mail and plate, a knight's helmet evolved dramatically. Early designs, like the Great Helm, enclosed the entire head in a barrel-shaped shell with narrow eye slits. A terrifying sight for enemies, limited visibility for the wearer. By the 15th century, the bassinet emerged. A pointed, close-fitting helm with a movable visor, allowing knights to lift it in tournaments or on marches. At Agincourt in 1415, many French knights abandoned heavy great helms for lighter bassinets, gaining better sight and airflow, yet they still found themselves vulnerable to longbow bolts striking their unprotected armpits or groin. In one era, helmets protected the head. In another, they created blind spots leading to deadly surprises. Let's talk weapons. In the 12th century, the knight's preferred weapon was the sword. A double-edged blade weighing about 3 to 4 pounds, ideal for cutting and thrusting. Yet swords struggled to penetrate mail and plate. To address this, knights carried maces, short, heavy clubs with flanged heads, designed to crush metal. A well-placed mace strike could dent a helm or incapacitate a mounted opponent. Gradually, polearms such as the halberd, combining an axe blade, spike, and hook, entered battlefields, useful for both infantry and dismounted knights. In one era, the sword symbolized nobility. In the other, it was sometimes relegated to ceremonial use when facing heavily armored foes. The lance reigned supreme in both warfare and tournaments. A knight charging with a couched lance, aimed under his arm, could break through a shield or knock an enemy from his saddle. Tournament lances were often blunted and fitted with a coronal, a round tip, to minimize fatalities. However, on the battlefield, lances retained razor-sharp points capable of piercing mail or even gaps in plate. At Poitiers in 1356, French knights learned to dread lances when Edward the Black Prince's men used coordinated pikes to stop their cavalry charges, leaving many knights impaled or unhorsed. In one era, lances symbolized aristocratic prowess. In another, they became unwieldy tools easily countered by disciplined infantry. A knight's sidearm, commonly a dagger, served as a last resort in close quarters. Known as a rondel dagger, it featured a tapered spike designed to slip between mail rings or find gaps in plate. Think of a knight pinned beneath his fallen horse, his sword gone. With only a dagger, he could still attempt to strike at weak points, the visor seam, the armpit, or the back of the neck. These crude yet deadly tools remind us that one misstep could turn a knight's steel advantage into a death sentence. In one era, a dagger was a backup. In another, it was sometimes the only chance for survival. Now, let's turn our attention to the knight's most vital ally, the warhorse, or destrier. These massive animals, often 15 to 16 hands high, bred for both strength and spirited temperament, represented as much a weapon as a lance. Consider Sir William Marshall, who, after returning from crusade around 1191, wrote to his steward insisting on feeding his destrier oats 3 times a day to maintain its great strength and courage. A well-bred destrier could weigh up to 1,200 pounds and wore its own barding, plate or mail protection, to shield its head and chest. Yet breeding, training, and keeping such a horse healthy drained a knight's purse. In one era, a destrier symbolized martial prestige. In the other, it devoured resources, hay, grain, farrier costs, like a small village, feeding logistics on campaign-tested medieval armies. A destrier consumed roughly 10 to 12 pounds of forage daily, hay or oats, plus fresh water, requiring a stable crew of grooms to manage. During Edward I's 1298 campaign in Scotland, records show royal requisitions of whole villages' hay reserves to sustain the king's cavalry. Muskets and modern logistics have streamlined feeding armies today. In the 13th century, gathering fodder meant diverting men from combat to forage parties. risking ambush by enemy scouts. The warhorse was a knight's pride but also a logistical Achilles heel. Maintaining armor and weapons required skilled craftsmen, armor smiths, blacksmiths, leatherworkers. A single plate breastplate might require 50 to 60 pounds of wrought iron shaped over heat, hammered by master smiths, then polished. Further, leather straps, buckles, and padding ensured the armor fit snugly without chafing. The cost of these craftsmen's time, plus the raw materials, meant only wealthy knights could afford bespoke equipment. Lower-ranking men-at-arms might make do with second-hand suits, patched mail, dented helms, and beaten-up shields. In one era, precision craftsmanship defined a knight's status. In another, reused gear often meant going into battle with faulty protection. Several knights made their fortunes on the tournament circuit, gambling on victories and capturing opponents for ransom to fund better gear. William Marshall again stands out. By the time Marshall was 21, he had already won so many tournaments that he captured hundreds of knights, ransoms providing the funds for his first full suit of plate. Yet tournament armor differed from battlefield armor. Lighter, more decorative, and tuned for spectacle rather than true protection. When Marshall sued a rival for damaging his expensive armor in 1178, he underscored how crucial and costly these suits were. In one era, tournaments inspired chivalric glamour. In another, they fueled economic desperation. Cost didn't stop at acquisition. Knights needed grooms to care for horses, squires to maintain armor, and a traveling smith if campaign demands grew dire. Muster rolls from King Edward III's 1346 invasion of France reveal that many English knights pressed a traveling armor smith into service, patching arrow holes, realigning dented plate, and resharpening swords between marches. Without this support, armor lost integrity. Tiny cracks could become deathly flaws in combat. In one era, shining plate impressed enemies. In another, a poorly maintained breastplate could betray a knight's heart. Despite these burdens, knights viewed equipment as essential to honor. Medieval codes held that a knight without proper arms and armor was unworthy of the name. The Libro de la Orden de Caballeria by Ramon Llull, written around 1275, argued that a knight's arms were extensions of his identity, symbols of virtue and devotion. Yet Llull also cautioned that true knighthood came from the soul, not mere outward display. In one era, equipment was identity. In another, it was just flammable iron and leather easily broken. Let's pause for a brief lesson. In our modern world, professionals invest in tools, doctors in stethoscopes, photographers in cameras, believing that better gear leads to better performance. Yet often, it's the training and skill that matter most. A surgeon with a basic scalpel can outperform one with robot-assisted devices, just as a knight wielding a simple arming sword could outfight one encumbered by cumbersome ceremonial armor. Recognizing that tools amplify ability but don't replace skill helps us calibrate expectations. Whether in the 14th century or the 21st, gear alone does not guarantee success. Mastery of one's craft does. As we forge ahead to our next discussion, keep in mind how equipment shaped the knight's life, physically, economically, and socially. In our upcoming section, Chivalric Code and Practice. From courtly ideals to combat realities, we'll examine how knights balanced lofty vows of honor with the brutal imperatives of war. How did a man in full plate reconcile mercy with the drive to subdue enemies with lethal force? How did religious teachings shape battlefield conduct? Stay tuned as we explore the tension between ideals and actions, reminding us that a knight's greatest tool was not his sword, but his conscience. The armor may clank, the lance may fly, but the heart beneath the armor would decide the true measure of a knight. For many of us, the term chivalry evokes images of noble knights gallantly rescuing damsels, offering courteous bows, and defending the weak. Yet for medieval knights themselves, chivalric ideals often collided with the relentless brutality of combat. In one era, the knight was expected to embody Christian virtue, courage, courtesy, and mercy, while in the other, the same knight faced a tangled web of loyalties, violence, and survival imperatives. How did these ideals play out on and off the battlefield? Let's explore the tension between courtly codes and the grim realities of warfare. At the heart of medieval knighthood lay a code, an unwritten but widely understood set of principles governing behavior. These principles varied by region and decade, but common threads ran through them. Bravery in battle, loyalty to one's lord, protection of the church, respect toward noblewomen, and mercy toward defeated foes. Manuals like Ramon Huey's Book of the Order of Chivalry, circa 1275, or Geoffroy de Charny's Book of Chivalry, mid-14th century, laid out these virtues explicitly, describing how a true knight should conduct himself, never breaking an oath, fighting fairly, and offering hospitality to guests. In one era, knights aspired to immortal fame captured in troubadour songs. In the other, they discovered that real life offered few tidy moral victories. The literature of chivalry often presented knights as paragons of virtue. Take the tale of Sir Eustace the Blessed, a 13th century English knight whose legendary deeds included defending convents against marauding invaders and ransoming captured peasants, all the while maintaining humility and deference to his superiors. Chroniclers wrote of his knightly vespers, his refusal to partake in tournaments if unfair odds prevailed, and his generous alms to the poor. Yet, historians caution that figures like Sir Eustace often straddled the line between myth and record. Their stories reflect not just personal valor, but the ideals resonating in courtly circles, shaped by aristocratic aspirations. In truth, countless knights lived far from these idealistic scripts, balancing feudal obligations, economic pressures, and the raw demands of survival. Consider an illustrative moment from the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192. As Richard the Lionheart's forces marched toward Acre, Richard famously negotiated a temporary truce to gather water for his dehydrated army, an act often cited as chivalrous. When Muslim defenders under Saladin observed Christian knights lifting the siege for a brief respite, they were surprised by this gesture of mercy. Yet that very night, a contingent of Frankish knights violated the ceasefire, raiding Saladin's supply lines. The result: skirmishes resumed, and both sides hardened their stances. In one era, chivalry prevailed in high-profile symbolic deeds. In the other, opportunistic violence still erupted because individual knights, lords, or captains pursued immediate tactical advantage. Another poignant example emerges from the Hundred Years' War, 1337 to 1453. The English longbowmen and French knights often clashed at Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356. After Poitiers, the Black Prince captured the French King John II. Contemporary accounts emphasize that John, though a captive, received respectful treatment. The Black Prince allowed him personal quarters, retained his standard, and accorded him full courtesies befitting a monarch. For this, the Black Prince earned praise in chivalric circles as a model knight. Yet just miles away, the same English army was looting villages, burning crops, and hanging local peasants suspected of spying. In one era, John's dignified captivity embodied chivalric restraint. In another, daily atrocities underscored the savage realties endured by non-combatants. Beyond the battlefield, chivalric codes influenced how knights managed their estates and interacted with neighbors. A knight's court might host lavish banquets, jests, and pageants promoting ideals of courtesy and honor. A 14th century tournament in Champagne drew knights from across France, mixing rivalries with spectacle. Each combatant donned his finest armor. Each lady bestowed a colored scarf upon a favorite. Yet imagine the same knight returning home from that festivity only to find his steward mismanaging the manor's finances. He might abandon courtesy for harsh fines, forcing peasants deeper into debt to maintain his lifestyle. In one era, social rituals reinforced chivalric bonds. In the other, economic necessity appended those bonds, leaving ordinary people to suffer under increasing dues. What about mercy to vanquished foes, a central tenet of chivalry? Medieval chronicles often recount moments when knights called off pursuit to spare a fallen rival. In 1214, during the Battle of Bouvines, Philip II of France captured Otto IV of the Holy Roman Empire. Although Otto's side had waged brutal warfare for years, Philip not only spared his life but provided for his comforts in captivity, treating him more like an honored guest than a prisoner. Courtiers praised Philip for embodying the noble spirit. Yet just months prior, French knights ravaged Flemish farms, slaughtered peasants, and razed entire villages under suspicion of disloyalty. In one era, mercy toward princely captives featured in romance. In the other, peasants born in chivalric lands found little mercy on rainy fields. Perhaps the most jarring contrast between chivalric ideals and wartime conduct appears in siege warfare. A chronicler at the Siege of Acre, 1291, notes how Crusader knights treated certain Saracen defenders with respect when they surrendered, arranging safe passage to nearby territories. Yet within the same campaign, other knights flouted those terms and sacked villages along the coast. They enslaved families, sold captives at slave markets in Tripoli, and desecrated mosques. In one era, a knight's honor hinged on upholding tax. In another, the lure of plunder trampled any moral constraint. How could a knight reconcile an oath to protect the church with greed that drove him to despoil Christian pilgrim routes for quick profit? Even in those moments when knights tried to live up to chivalric codes, structural pressures frequently undermined them. Feudal lords demanded taxes to maintain retinues. Mercenary captains urged quick convoys of loot. Religious expectations weighed on the soul. By the mid-14th century, knights paid scutage, money in lieu of service, to avoid personally serving in campaigns. Some did so to preserve limited resources, but many also sought to avoid combat's slaughterhouse. 7 years earlier, the Order of the Garter formed under Edward III explicitly to codify chivalric values in the midst of turbulent warfare. Their motto, Honi soit mal white pence, shamed be he who thinks evil of it, signified a commitment to uphold chivalry even while war raged. Yet for every Garter knight, dozens of lesser nobles raised unpaid levies, pillaged English countryside for supplies, and flaunted oaths for profit. In one era, chivalric brotherhood excelled. In the other, profit reigned supreme. Let's pause here and reflect on a short lesson. Whenever individuals pledge to ideals, whether in business ethics, academic honor codes, or professional oaths, the gap between aspiration and reality often reveals itself under pressure. A doctor might swear do no harm, yet must decide whether to accept a risky procedure to save a life. An attorney pledges fairness, yet might face incentives to prolong litigation for greater fees. In chivalric terms, knights vowed mercy and loyalty, but faced overwhelming temptations and structural pressures that compromised those vows. Our takeaway: understanding ideals is crucial, but navigating real-world complexities requires humility, pragmatism, and constant self-scrutiny. Shifting our focus back to the Middle Ages, we find that some knights strove to adhere to chivalric principles even amid contradictions. One exemplary figure was Sir James Douglas of Scotland, known as the Black Douglas. In 1314, after the Battle of Bannockburn, Douglas captured a wealthy English baron but released him without ransom when he discovered the baron's son was allied to Robert the Bruce. Douglas later insisted on humane treatment of prisoners during the Siege of Perth in 1339, refusing to indulge in mass executions common among his contemporaries. In one era, Douglas eluded cynicism by consistently demonstrating compassion. In another, he faced suspicion. Peers questioned whether his mercy jeopardized Scottish war efforts. Yet even Douglas was not immune to dark impulses. During the Siege of Roxburgh, 1314, he ordered that several captured defenders be hanged, provoking debtors to lament that no mercy was granted. His behavior highlights that chivalric adherence was never absolute. Context, personal vendettas, and political pressures shaped actions. Similarly, the machinations at courts sometimes forced knights to commit atrocities to secure favor. Sir William de la Pole, after serving Edward III in France, suppressed rebellions in Lincolnshire, 1322, and Coventry, 1323, brutally, justifying his actions by citing greater strategic goals. In one era, chivalry required mercy. In the other, political survival called for ruthlessness. Over time, literate clerics and chroniclers critiqued knights who fell short of their codes. Jean Froissart, in his Chronicles, circa 1370 to 1400, lamented that many knights bore the name but not the heart of chivalry, describing rampant brigandage among mercenary companies sold to the highest bidder. His vivid accounts of such Condottieri wreaking havoc with castle raids and civilian massacres earned scorn from knightly readers who prided themselves on courtesy and honor. Yet Froissart's tone shifted when praising St. George's Day celebrations at royal courts, replete with pageantry, symbolic sword dances, and proclamations reaffirming knightly virtues. In one era, chroniclers called knights to higher standards. In the other, they recorded repeated failures to live up to them. By the 15th century, the practical value of chivalry on the battlefield waned. Firearms and pike tactics supplanted cavalry charges, reducing knights' traditional role. Many knights, trained for formal battles governed by codes of honor, found themselves cut down by a common archer or massed infantry. Ironically, this decline corresponded to a surge in chivalric romances. Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, 1469, captured popular imagination at a time when battlefield realities no longer favored heavily armored men on horseback. In one era, chivalry guided combat. In the other, it became nostalgic relic preserved in literature. As a final reflection before we move on, let's summarize our lesson. Principles alone cannot substitute for critical evaluation of circumstances. Whether in medieval chivalry or modern professional ethics, the temptation to interpret ideals flexibly, justifying questionable tactics for expediency, remains constant. Knights who sought to balance mercy with martial necessity found themselves in moral quandaries, just as we do when upholding standards amid conflicting pressures. Recognizing these challenges fosters empathy for historical figures and underscores the importance of transparent accountability structures to support ethical behavior. With the tension between courtly ideals and combat realities laid bare, we're ready to delve into the heart of medieval warfare's impact on knights' lives. In our next section, On the Battlefield, Tactics, Trauma, and True Horror, we'll examine how knights confronted the chaos of combat. Clashing swords, thundering hooves, and screaming wounded. We'll explore first-hand accounts of battle trauma, the evolution of tactics to counter cavalry charges, and how knights coped with the psychological toll. Join us as we step across the breach from chivalric aspirations into the crucible of medieval warfare. The moment a knight spurs his destrier toward the enemy line, he steps into a world utterly unlike the orderly drills of training grounds or the ceremonial pageantry of tournaments. Medieval battlefields were ovens of mud, blood, and terror, far removed from the idealized justs depicted in tapestries. In one era, knights believed that valor and honor would see them victorious. In the other, they discovered that survival often depended on raw brutality, quick wit, and sometimes a terrible luck. Let's journey across the field where steel clanged on steel, arrows whistled through the air, and the cries of the wounded rose above the clash of arms. By understanding the tactics, the physical and psychological toll, and the sensory onslaught of combat, we can better appreciate the full measure of a knight's experience. As trained warriors emerged from their encampments at dawn, they faced a choice of tactics that varied by region and period. In the early 13th century, heavy cavalry charges, thunderous lines of armored knights riding shoulder to shoulder, dominated Western European warfare. Powerful destriers, clad in plate or mail, would gallop at full tilt into the enemy's front rank. Their combined momentum, weight, and lances recast a mass of infantry into chaos. One famed example is the Battle of Bouvines in 1214. Under King Philip II of France, French knights feigned a retreat, luring Otto IV's German knights into overextension. At the crucial moment, French knights wheeled about and slammed into Otto's flank, shattering his cavalry and turning victory decisively in Philip's favor. In one era, cavalry represented knighthood's apex. In the other, clever countermaneuvers could render that prestige useless. Yet not every battlefield favored the charge. At Bannockburn in 1314, Robert the Bruce's Scots used schiltrons, tight formations of spearmen, against Edward II's advancing knights. These pike fields, bristling with hundreds of polished steel points, formed nearly impenetrable hedges. When Edward's cavalry thundered in, many horses plunged headfirst into the spear wall and knights were flung to the mud, helpless. An English squire, Thomas Gray, later wrote that he saw men and steeds alike fall like autumn leaves, impaled upon the enemy's pikes. In one era, the knight's lance was king. In the other, disciplined infantry turned those same lances into lethal stakes. By the mid-14th century, the English longbow began to alter the calculus of battle. At Crecy, 1346, Edward III's archers loosed volleys of arrows that fell thicker than rain, ripping through French mail and knocking knights from their saddles long before they closed in. One French chronicler recorded that arrows darkened the sky. The ground where they struck heaved with the death cries of horses and men. In such conditions, mounted knights found themselves vulnerable. A wound that might have been nothing more than a flesh graze without armor became a mortal puncture to the chest. In one era, chivalric codes favored pitched cavalry clashes. In the other, swift archery decimated those codes before they could be fully enacted. When battle lines finally clashed, organized tactics dissolved into close-quarters melee, the true test of a knight's mettle. Knights, with visors down, could see little beyond the flanking knights and horses milling about in a muddy press. Faces were hidden behind reinforcing bars. Hands gripped hafts of swords and axes, muscles screaming beneath layers of mail and plate. The shock of a charging warhorse felt like being run over by a logging wagon, while the ring of steel on steel seemed to drum in the skull. One anonymous French knight, fighting at Agincourt in 1415, recounted how mud clung to my greaves so that I stumbled under its weight. Each time I raised my helm to breathe, a torrent of dust and bodily odor rushed in. I heard only the broken moans of friends who lay in the mud, armor riveted to them as though a tomb had claimed them alive. In one era, combat seemed a noble art. In the other, it was a disorienting nightmare. Amidst such frenzy, trauma manifested both physically and mentally. Splintered lances crushed helmets, fractured jaws, and shattered limbs. A knight might survive by slipping into a mud hole, only to be trampled by horses an hour later. Those lucky enough to be pulled away could face amputation without anesthesia, sometimes by a barber surgeon wielding a saw over a drunken campfire. Infection, gangrene, sepsis became as lethal as any blade. Brother Richard Maidstone, witnessing the Battle of Lincoln, 1217, wrote, "Blood seeped into every fold of mail, festering beneath, so that by nightfall many men who escaped the sword succumbed to their wounds, their flesh blackening like rotten fruit. In one era, wounds healed. In the other, they festered to deadly effect. Psychological scars also carved deep grooves. Knights who returned home carried the stench of rotting corpses in their nostrils for months, haunted by the sight of friends hacked to pieces." Jean de Burgogne, a Burgundian knight, described his nightmares after the melee of Ashby in 1403. "I dreamt I heard the hoofbeats of horses trampling fallen men, their cries echoing like hellfire. Even at a feast, I saw phantom blood on my plate." These nightmares were not anomalies. Our modern concept of post-traumatic stress disorder finds its medieval analog in knights who could not unhear the groans or unsee the gore. In one era, knighthood promised glory. In the other, it exacted a terrible psychological toll. Captivity could be as cruel as injury. When a knight fell into enemy hands, his ransom awaited, if his family could pay the price. At Poitiers in 1356, French King John II was taken prisoner. Though he received lordly treatment, many lesser knights languished in dank dungeons, chained to walls, fed scraps, and forced to survive on meager rations. Those who couldn't pay ransom faced slavery or execution. Sir Thomas Diony, captured at Crecy, waited 2 years for a ransom payment of 600 écus, a fortune that nearly bankrupted his estates. In one era, being captured offered a path to reunion. In the other, it threatened ruin and long-term suffering. Yet, amid this horror, moments of camaraderie and martial respect sometimes pierced the darkness. Chroniclers note that after the Battle of Sluis, 1340, English and French survivors bound their wounds together and shared meager bread and water. They spoke through interpreters of family beyond the battle lines, their shared humanity eclipsing political rivalries. In one era, enemies faced off in mortal combat. In the other, they recognized that bravery and sacrifice belonged to every warrior, regardless of banner. Even in victory, knights confronted grim aftermaths. The field became a slaughterhouse, littered with broken bodies and horses, clotted with gore. Dogs and birds descended to scavenge. Crows perched atop blackened carcasses. Wolves prowled under cover of dusk. It was common to find scavengers ripping through flesh as living men reloaded crossbows mere yards away. In one era, knights dreamed of victory celebrations. In the other, they navigated a landscape of stench and scavengers, daring to hope they would live to taste it. Let's pause for a short lesson. No matter how noble our intentions or codes of honor, conflict inevitably brings cruelty and trauma. Modern soldiers in every war face this stark reality. What begins as a mission to defend or liberate can morph into a crucible of moral dilemma and psychological strain. Recognizing that few combatants emerge unscathed, physically or mentally, helps us better honor their sacrifices and underscores the importance of robust support systems for veterans. In one era, knights were lauded for chivalry. In the other, they suffered trauma that shaped the rest of their lives. As healing began, survivors faced months of convalescence. A knight might walk with a limp for life, his jaw wired shut, or rely on early forms of prosthetics, wooden legs carved to fit under armor. Some turned to pilgrimages, seeking spiritual relief along shrines from Canterbury to Santiago de Compostela. Others withdrew from courtly life entirely, joining monasteries to atone for deeds done in battle. In one era, valor won accolades. In the other, guilt and pain drove men to seek refuge in prayer. Yet warfare evolved. By the late 15th century, firearms and pike formations transformed tactics once more. At the Battle of Pavia in 1525, imperial arquebusiers unleashed volleys that felled French knights long before they could charge. The pike squares of Swiss mercenaries held off cavalry. Siege artillery battered castle walls previously deemed impregnable. Knighthood as the military class began to fade. In one era, the knight was the spearhead of war. In the other, he became a relic, more likely to don plate for tournament display than to ride into battle with lance couched. Despite these technological shifts, the knight's experience of combat trauma remained constant. Whether facing a wall of Chiltern at Bannockburn or a hail of musket balls at Pavia, mortal danger sharpened the mind and fractured the spirit. William de la Pole, a knight who survived both Crécy and Agincourt, later wrote of how he felt my senses waver as the arrows fell like hail. Yet I clung to life as though death were a distant dream. In one era, plate and lance defined the knight's world. In the other, gunpowder and ironclad tactics sealed his obsolescence. But the fear and carnage felt eerily familiar. As we prepare to step back from the front lines, let's reflect on the meaning behind these tales of tactics and terror. Knights wielded weapons forged by skilled smiths, used tactics honed by centuries of warfare, and yet found themselves as vulnerable as any man, subject to disease, poor vision in heavy helms, and the random whims of fortune. Their trauma and brutality mirror our own history of violent conflict, reminding us that valor and horror often come hand in hand. Recognizing this duality enriches our understanding of medieval knights not merely as romantic icons, but as fallible humans shaped by circumstance. Transitioning now to our next exploration, we move from open-field chaos to the relentless ordeal of siege warfare. In the following section, the art of siege warfare, engineering, starvation, and innovation, we'll examine how knights adapted to protracted battles of attrition. We'll discuss trebuchets hurling boulders, miners tunneling beneath walls, and defenders rationing food until the last drop of water. From open-field charges to castle sieges, knights faced both flash moments of glory and prolonged stretches of terror, each demanding different strengths of body and spirit. At a castle stone gate, a swift cavalry charge meant little. There, ingenuity, patience, and the sheer will to endure became the real measures of a knight's worth. When we imagine knights storming castles, the drama often feels like a theatrical spectacle. Towers scaling, rams battering gates, defenders pouring boiling oil from battlements. Yet the reality of siege warfare was a grinding ordeal that tested endurance, engineering ingenuity, and human limits. In one era, a well-fortified castle represented near invincibility. In the other, clever innovation and unrelenting pressure turned stone walls into crumbling ruins. Let's journey into this world where long stretches of boredom gave way to days of terror, and where survival hinged as much on logistics as on prowess with the sword. The essence of siege warfare rested on two opposing mindsets: attackers seeking rapid breakthroughs and defenders determined to hold out for relief. Attackers assembled armies in sprawling encampments, carted in supplies, and set up complex machinery, trebuchets, mangonels, and siege towers, as soon as they could secure a forward base. Defenders, meanwhile, relied on concentric walls, moats, arrow slits, and watchtowers to blunt assaults. In one era, a castle's high, thick curtain wall loomed like an iron fist. In the other, a trebuchet's deadly arcs turned those very walls into fragments of mortar and rubble. Early siege engines differed significantly from the iconic trebuchets of popular imagination. In the 11th and 12th centuries, mangonels, torsion-powered machines twisting ropes of sinew through stones or dead animals to spread disease inside castle walls. Imagine the siege of Antioch in 1098. Crusaders used mangonels to lob corpses of disease-ridden livestock over the walls, hoping to poison in-castle wells. A contemporary chronicler described how the vile stench of rotting flesh filled the air even before the stones fell, sending rats scrambling and sickness creeping through the defenders' ranks. In one era, defenders believed their moats and ramparts sufficed. In the other, biological tactics crawled beneath those defenses. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the trebuchet emerged, an engineering marvel harnessing counterweight force to hurl 100 to 200-pound boulders in wide arcs. At the siege of Chateau Gallard in 1204, Philip II's army deployed massive trebuchets assembled on site from timbers and iron fittings, the famed lions of Philip's arsenal, each weighing over 10 tons, reduced Richard the Lionheart's hilltop fortress to rubble over months. One eyewitness wrote, "Stone after stone rained upon the towers until they collapsed with thunderous roars, and the keep's foundation shook like a dying tree." In one era, Chateau Gallard's position atop steep slopes seemed impregnable. In the other, trebuchets reached behind any facade to deliver devastating blows. Attackers also used siege towers, wooden structures on wheels, bristling with archers, intended to equalize wall heights. Building these towers took weeks of labor, felling trees, carving beams, constructing inner staircases. At the Siege of Orleans in 1429, the English dispatched multiple large towers to assault the French defenses. Joan of Arc's forces targeted those towers with crossbow fire and burning pitch, setting them ablaze before they could reach the walls. As flames licked timber, defenders cheered, watching insurgent soldiers tumble to the mud below. In one era, towers symbolized the triumph of manpower. In the other, defenders showed that fire and steel could thwart wood. Mining and countermining played a pivotal role. Attackers dug tunnels beneath walls or towers, propping up supports with wood. Once the tunnel reached the target point, miners set supports ablaze, collapsing the wall. Defenders heard digging and responded with counterminers, baying into tunnels to intercept or collapse the attackers' passages. At the Siege of Castelnuovo in 1301, Venetian defenders listened for percussive echoes, pinpointed a French Catalan tunnel, and flooded it with water, forcing the miners to abandon their mission. In one era, walls felt permanent. In the other, subterranean efforts rendered stone ephemeral. Despite all these tools, the heart of siege warfare lay in bluff, attrition, and starvation. Attackers sometimes encircled a castle and simply waited for hunger to break the defenders' resolve. At Acre in 1291, Mamluk forces under Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil chose to besiege rather than storm the walls directly. For months, they blocked supply lines to this major crusader stronghold. Chroniclers recorded how water barrels dwindled. Rats became breakfast. Defenders boiled leather strips in hopes of drawing sustenance from proteinless broth. One friar who survived to recount the siege said, "Men gnawed on the skins of their horses, then boiled their own boots to gain strength. Many threw themselves into the sea rather than face the Mamluk sword when relief never came." In one era, Acre stood as a bulwark of Christendom. In the other, hunger, misery, and despair forced its gates to open. Starvation's horror became particularly visible at Mara in 1098. Chroniclers report that Christian crusaders, cut off from supplies during the First Crusade, resorted to cannibalism. Ralph of Can describes how those who could bear it no longer devoured horses, dogs, and mice, and at length hungry men devoured human flesh. Though later historians debate the scale of these atrocities, the persistent stories show how desperation overwhelmed knights' chivalric instincts. In one era, knights carried banners of holy war. In the other, they became victims of their own ambition, crossing moral boundaries under the shadow of starvation. Disease often spread rampantly in siege camps. Thousands of men, knights and infantry alike, lived in unsanitary conditions. Latrine pits overflowed, stagnant water pooled, and rats scurried among tents. Dysentery, typhoid, and scurvy took as many lives as enemy weapons. During the lengthy siege of Rouen, 1418 to 1419, English forces camped in marshy environs with rotting refuse. Chronicler and Guerin de Monstrelet writes that rats choked supply wagons, and men dropped dead on the march back to camp. In one era, a knight in shining armor felt invincible before the city. In the other, he succumbed to fever, undone by unseen bacteria rather than a visible adversary. On the flip side, defenders faced similar threats. Castle wells grew polluted, cisterns ran dry, and latrines overflowed in confined spaces. At the siege of Antioch in 1260, when Mongol forces pressed the city, still fortified since the First Crusade, guards reported that so many died of pestilence that their bodies lay unburied among the ramparts, and survivors avoided the walls as though they were hell itself. Even if relief armies approached, defenders often lacked the strength to mount effective sallies. In one era, fortified cities felt secure. In the other, disease lurked behind every arrow slit. Siege warfare also required massive logistical coordination. Armies needed consistent stores of fodder for horses, grain for men, and firewood for cooking and engine operation. Meanwhile, engineers measured wall thickness, tested foundation firmness, and calculated parabolic arcs for trebuchet trajectories. One record from Edward I's 1298 campaign in Scotland notes that the English king's provisions consumed every barn within 20 miles, and the horses starved before sacks of grain could arrive. In one era, knights rode into battle confident in their supplies. In the other, inadequate planning left them scavenging fields for even a kernel of barley. As the siege dragged on, knights often faced moral quandaries. If they defended a castle loyal to a lord hostile to their overlord, they were branded traitors. If they disobeyed an order to resist while civilians starved, they risked contempt and dishonor. During the siege of Wark Castle in 1138, the English garrison received a summons to surrender. Their commander refused, and men, knights and squires alike, spent endless nights praying and musketing crossbow strings. When conditions worsened, they had to decide whether to fight on or yield to honorably spare their families. Chroniclers note that some knights chose to fall on their swords rather than compromise loyalty. Others opened the gates, living with the shame of surrender. In one era, honor demanded holding out. In the other, honor demanded mercy toward innocent dependents. Over time, advances in gunpowder technology brought early cannons to siege fields. By the late 14th century, hand bombards blasted holes in walls that trebuchets once struggled to breach. At the siege of Constantinople in 1453, Ottoman cannons pulverized Theodosian walls, fortifications that had repelled invaders for centuries. Sultan Mehmed II enlisted Hungarian engineer Urban to cast massive bronze cannons, each hurling 600-pound balls. Chroniclers describe the walls, shaking like great drums, as stone rained down. In one era, Achilles-style heroics might win a wall. In the other, a lump of iron ended the fight before knights could draw swords. Yet even in the face of cannon fire, barefoot defenders held out. Greek engineer Giovanni Giustiniani, tasked with defending the city, led sorties against Ottoman sapper tunnels and constantly repaired breaches under fire. On May 29th, as the final breach widened, Giustiniani fell mortally wounded. The city's defenders lost heart, and Constantinople fell. In one era, knights defended Uruk's bastion. In the other, guns opened the road to global transformation. As we draw our siege chronicle to a close, it's clear that knights' roles evolved from mounting sorties and commanding defenses to managing rations, tending to disease, and directing engineers. Their identity shifted from individual heroes charging over walls to logistical coordinators balancing food, ammunition, and morale. The constant, however, remained human suffering, whether the target was a king's castle or a humble village caught in collateral crossfire. Before we move to our next chapter, where knights gathered not to besiege but to joust in tournaments, it's helpful to take a final lesson from siege warfare. Even the strongest defenses can crumble without coherent planning, innovation, and compassion for non-combatants caught in the crossfire. Whether medieval or modern, conflict demands not just force, but strategy, resources, and empathy. Castles fell because defenders starved, disease spread, or cannons roared. Similarly, contemporary disputes can be resolved not solely through military hardware but through careful diplomacy, humanitarian aid, and conflict resolution. As we transition to tournament theater, glory, gambling, and grave consequences, remember that siege and tournament represent two sides of the knightly experience. In one era, battles raged on stone walls. In the other, lances cracked in the lists. When knights left the crushing siege camps for the pageantry of tournament grounds, they donned gleaming armor not to break open defenses, but to showcase skill, attract patronage, and win prizes. Yet tournaments carried their own hazards: broken lances, shattered bones, and fortunes lost. Stay with us as we trade mud and starvation for the roar of crowds and the glitter of spectacle. Another chapter in the life of the medieval knight. Imagine a field next to a medieval city, surrounded by tents of colorful banners. Joust lists, fenced lanes lined with watching nobles stand ready, the clamor of trumpets, the scent of roasted meats, the gleam of polished steel. This is tournament day. In one era, the tournament was a proving ground for knights, a place to showcase valor and skill. In the other, it was a high-stakes gamble where fortunes were won and bodies were broken. As we explore tournament theater, we'll see how medieval contests combined martial practice, social spectacle, and economic risk in ways that echo today's extreme sports. In the 11th and early 12th centuries, tournaments began as large-scale melees. Knights on horseback charged at each other in free-for-all combat. Imagine hundreds of mounted warriors galloping toward one another, lances couched, swords drawn, all under the watchful eyes of local lords. Villagers spilled out of city gates to place bets on their favorite knights or simply to feast their eyes on the spectacle. Victory meant not only bragging rights, but also the spoils of captured opponents: horses, armor, and a hefty ransom. In one era, melees served as training for warfare. In the other, they ignited uncontrolled violence that cost countless lives. By the mid-12th century, European courts refined tournaments into more regulated events. The chaotic melee gave way to structured jests, two knights charging at each other along a flowered barrier called a tilt barrier or canal. Each aimed flag-tipped lances at an opponent's shield or breastplate, seeking the thrill of unhorsing him. Tournaments became annual courtly festivals, hosted by kings, dukes, or wealthy barons, lasting days or even weeks. Nobles from distant realms gathered not only to compete, but also to court favor, negotiate marriages, and cement alliances. In one era, knights fought bloody melees. In the other, they tilted lances in a choreographed dance of honor. One famous example occurred in 1240 at a tournament near Barletta, Italy, where French and German knights joined in a grand melee to celebrate King Frederick II's birthday. Despite efforts to control the fray, markers, boundaries, heralds calling combats, 83 knights died, many more were wounded. Chronicler Salim de Adam recorded that the earth drank deeply of noble blood that day, and the fields reeked of steel and sinew. Hosts intended spectacle. Instead, they witnessed carnage rivaling minor battles. In one era, tournaments built knightly prestige. In the other, they underscored how quickly controlled contests could devolve into tragedy. Over time, tournament regulations became increasingly elaborate. By the 14th century, knights paid entry fees to participate, ensuring that only those with means could join. Each competitor brought a host of squires, armed retinues, and baggage trains. Spare lances, extra horses, repair kits for broken armor, and provisions for days in the lists. Rules prescribed the number of passes with a lance, scoring methods for breaking a tilt barrier, and penalties for foul blows. Occasionally, a knight wielded a mace or sword in a secondary contest. Yet, even with strict rules, injuries were common. In 1304, at a tournament in Paris, a single lance break severed a knight's wrist. Infection set in, leading to amputation. In one era, these rules promised fairness. In the other, they offered scant protection against serious harm. Tournaments also offered economic opportunity, both for victors and for local economies. Johnny Thorington, a merchant from London, noted in his journal how a tournament in 1387 at York mobilized hundreds of tradesmen, tent makers, armor smiths, poulterers, and brewers. Inns overflowed, taverns rang with coin, and merchants profited from pilgrims who followed knights' banners to watch the events. Yet, a knight pitted all his resources on a single tilt. When Sir Humphrey Fitzalan lost his lance against Sir Roger de Morley in 1390, he forfeited his warhorse, a prime destrier worth 3 times the average annual income of a squire. To recover, Humphrey had to sell off sections of his land. In one era, tournaments fueled vibrant commerce. In the other, they plunged families into debt. Gambling added another perilous layer. Spectators bet on individual knights' prowess, wagering sums equal to a day's labor wages or entire annual incomes. A single errant lance could swing fortunes overnight. Sir William Grey, at a tournament in London in 1423, lost his entire retinue, 7 horses, 2 squires, and his best armor, to Sir Nicholas Heron when his lance splintered prematurely. Desperate to recoup, Grey returned to real warfare in France, where he perished at Morlakes in 1426. In one era, tournaments ignited communal celebration. In the other, they triggered ruinous gambling debts that steered knights back to bloody fields. For all the roles, accidents were inevitable. In 1559, King Henry II of France's fatal injury at a tournament marked a symbolic end to the age of chivalric gallantry. A shiver of terror ran through onlookers when Henry's opponent, Gabriel Montgomery, struck Henry's unprotected eye through a gap in his visor. The king lingered in agony for days before dying of infection. Chroniclers recount how courtiers knelt in horror as news spread across France. Tournaments that once symbolized courtly pageantry now felt like lethal roulette. In one era, monarchs competed alongside nobles. In the other, even kings fell victim to their own chivalric passions. Yet beyond high-profile catastrophes, many tournaments ended in broken bones, concussions, and crippling injuries. Knights wrapped in heavy plate found their necks snapped by unbalanced lances or fell awkwardly to the ground, shattering limbs. Physicians, often barbers skilled in bloodletting, rushed to bleed wounds and extract shards of wood or steel. One 14th century surgeon's manual describes treating a knight whose helm was crushed, revealing a scalp wound that gushed forth blood and bone splinters, requiring cauterization before setting fractured skull fragments. In one era, a knight's visor was his best friend. In the other, it trapped gore against his face, impeding breathing and vision. Despite the hazards, knighthood's prestige drove many to risk it all for tournament glory. A fleeting triumph could transform a lesser noble into a storied champion. Sir Jean Le Bon, at a tournament in Bruges in 1393, bested 20 opponents in successive jests, capturing their horses, armor, and ransoms. His triumph funded the purchase of lands that elevated his family's status for generations. Yet some champions paid the ultimate price. Sir Peter Courtenay, after winning 2 successive sweeps in tournament lists at Poitiers in 1376, sustained a neck injury that left him unable to tilt again. In one era, fleeting glory immortalized new heroes. In the other, it ended careers and dissolved family fortunes in a heartbeat. Tournaments held a critical social function beyond martial exhibitions. They offered a stage for nobles and magnates to present themselves, display heraldry, and form alliances. At the tournament of St. Ingilbert in 1390, King Charles VI of France provided lavish feasts and ointments, symbolic gestures of royal favor, to the tournament's victor, Sir Thomas Montague. That simple favor elevated Montague's standing at court, leading to marriage negotiations with a wealthy Burgundian heiress. In one era, tournaments were training grounds for warfare. In the other, They served as matrimonial marketplaces and political theaters. Yet tournaments could also intensify feuds. Historical records reveal that rival knights sometimes used tournaments to bait each other into duels, or to settle long-running vendettas under the guise of sport. At a tournament in Champagne around 1325, Sir Raoul d'Ansenoy purposely targeted a known adversary, Sir Guillaume de Brienne, with a lance thrust so forceful that it nearly killed him. When Guillaume's brother retaliated in a later tournament, vicious street fights erupted among supporters, leaving dozens dead. In one era, tournaments codified honorable combat. In the other, they became arenas for vengeance and violence beyond the lists. Let's pause to draw a short lesson from the tournament's splendor and peril. In modern life, high-stakes competitions, say professional sports or business pitches, offer enormous rewards but also carry substantial risk. Athletes train for years, knowing that a single misstep can end a career or cause lifelong injury. Business leaders launch ventures, sometimes betting personal savings on success. Understanding the balance between pursuing glory and managing risk can help us make better decisions. As in medieval tournaments, preparation, strategy, and respect for one's limitations are vital, whether on the lists or in a boardroom. As tournament culture matured in the 15th century, events grew even more elaborate. Heralds painted lists with bright colors. Ladies presented favors, scarves, gloves, to knights they admired. Bards composed songs praising the best jousters. Yet the evolving role of gunpowder on battlefields mirrored a shift in tournaments. By the late 15th century, lances were more heavily blunted, and rules banned certain lethal blows. Tournaments became safer and, critics argued, less authentic. In 1445, a Venetian diplomat wrote, "Once, a knight's worth was proven in the roar of splintering wood and the tumble of man and horse. Now it is measured in colorful cloth and tempered lances." In one era, tournaments honed lethal skill. In the other, they prioritized spectacle and safety. As we shift our focus from tournament lists back to broader knightly life, it's clear that these contests were microcosms of medieval society, a place where ideals of honor clashed with greed, fraternal loyalty dissolved into rivalry, and celebration coexisted with sorrow. In our next section, Knights of Legends and Atrocities, comparing exemplars and villains, we'll explore how some knights embodied chivalric ideals, figures like William Marshall or Sir James Douglas, while others, like Roald de Cambrai or Ramon Mercader, descended into cruelty. By comparing these extremes, we'll see how the same armor and code could foster heroism or horror. In Shining Steel, we find both noble aspirations and dark impulses waiting to be unleashed. In the medieval world, the figure of the knight could symbolize the highest ideals of chivalry or the darkest depths of brutality. On one hand, we find men who upheld vows of loyalty, mercy, and justice, garnering admiration far beyond their lifetimes. On the other, we encounter those whose exploits spread fear, warlords who razed villages, slaughtered innocents, and betrayed every chivalric band. By examining these contrasting lives, we glimpse how a single code chivalry could foster both heroic exemplars and ruthless villains. Let's begin with the shining example of William Marshall, often hailed as the greatest knight of his age. Born around 1147 to a minor noble family, William found himself a hostage at 5 due to his father's political machinations. Yet his innate prowess shone early. As a squire in Normandy, he demonstrated extraordinary strength and courage. His first recorded tourney, at age 20, saw him unhorse dozens of opponents, earning a ransom so large that it funded his first full suit of armor. By one era's measure, William embodied the chivalric ideal: valor in battle, unwavering loyalty to his feudal lords, and a sense of honorable conduct. For the next 5 decades, he fought for Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, King John, and young Henry III, never breaking a sworn oath. Yet William's life was not free from the era's brutality. During the rebellion of 1215, he besieged rebel barons at Rochester Castle, ordering mines dug beneath the keep. When the walls collapsed, he sanctioned hanging 40 defenders to force surrender. Chroniclers record his heartfelt prayers before the gallows. Yet they also note that once battle commenced, He dealt out cruelty with the same hand that once raised banners of mercy. In one era, William's mercy in sparing his father's life earned him royal favor. In the other, his hand guided gallows rogues without hesitation. His legacy lives on. After King John's sudden death by dysentery in 1216, William assumed regency for the young Henry III, steering England through civil war, reissuing the Magna Carta to stabilize the realm, and founding an enduring model of moderate, principled leadership. His tomb in Temple Church, London, became a pilgrimage for aspiring knights centuries later. Yet, careful study reminds us that his greatness emerged not from unblemished virtue, but from navigating moral grayness, blending mercy with ruthlessness as circumstances demanded. In a similar vein, Sir James Douglas of Scotland, known as the Black Douglas, offers another exemplar of chivalric nuance. Born into a powerful Scots family, Douglas served Robert the Bruce during the Wars of Scottish Independence. At the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, he led a crucial cavalry charge against the English flank, helping secure victory. Yet Douglas was also famous for his humane treatment of prisoners. After capturing an English baron who begged for mercy because of his mother's pleas, Douglas released him ransom-free, saying that his honor demanded it. In one era, this generosity shone as proof of chivalric virtue. In the other, political rivals whispered that Douglas's leniency risked Bruce's cause. Douglas's defining moment came after King Robert died in 1329. Bruce's heart had been embalmed and sealed in a silver casket. He wished it taken on crusade to Jerusalem. Douglas vowed to fulfill that wish, marching with a small company into Spain en route to the Holy Land. At the Battle of Tobai in 1330, he hurled himself into the fray, casket draped against his chest. When he fell, bristling with arrows, his friends found him with the casket clutched to his heart. His final act epitomized loyalty above self, yet it also cost him his life. In one era, Douglas's devotion radiated pure chivalry. In the other, his death deprived Scotland of one of its greatest living strategists. But for every Marshal and Douglas, history records knights who abused knightly privilege to commit heinous atrocities. Consider Raoul de Cambrai, a 10th century French noble whose deeds later inspired the epic Raoul de Cambrai. After being denied lands by Herbert II of Vermandois, Raoul rebelled violently, burning towns, slaughtering peasants, and razing churches. Chronicler Richard of Reims alleged that Raoul's forces burned a convent, immolated nuns who refused his demands, and fed their remains to attacking hounds as a show of pagan cruelty. In one era, Raoul's rebellion represented personal grievance. In the other, it symbolized chivalric abandonment, his ambition stripped of all moral constraint. Raoul's life serves as a stark reminder that the chivalric code could be manipulated to justify plunder. His primary motivation was power and vengeance, not fealty or virtue. In 943, he marched on Origny, laying siege to the monastery. When the abbot offered ransom in gold, Raoul beheaded him on the spot, demonstrating cruelty within a framework that might have otherwise offered room for mercy. Chroniclers questioned how one knight could forsake every oath once the prospect of riches and revenge gleamed. In one era, warrior skill should have served communal defense. In the other, it became a tool of predation. Centuries later, Ramon Mercader and his Almogavers illustrated a form of knightly atrocity shaped by religious fervor. In 1303, the Byzantine Emperor Andronicus II recruited these Catalan mercenaries to repel Turkish incursions in Anatolia. From their first engagement, Mercader's men operated with ruthless efficiency, starving villages, slaughtering civilians, and impaling prisoners on stakes. Byzantine sources describe towns where no living creature remained, not even dogs, after the Almogavers swept through. In one era, mercenary knights were esteemed for martial skill. In the other, their disregard for civilians revealed the worst extremes of knightly license. After fulfilling their contract, Mercader's men turned on their Byzantine employers when wages were withheld. Laden with unpaid gold, they rampaged through Byzantine lands, sacking towns, looting churches, and murdering civilians indiscriminately. In one era, they were Christian knights employed by a Christian emperor. In the other, they treated co-religionists as expendable collateral. Eventually, Byzantium paid them off, but only after devastating swaths of Anatolia and the Peloponnese. Mercator ended his career as a landed lord in Sicily, ironically rewarded for his bloodletting. By comparing these two extremes, exemplar and villain, we see that knighthood was never strictly about equipment or technique. Instead, it hinged on personal choices within a framework of societal incentives. William Marshall's decision to spare or execute was shaped by feudal pressures and familial ties. Raoul de Cambrai's rebellion sprang from familial loss and a thirst for vengeance. Douglas's final stand reflected personal loyalty to a king and creed. Mercator's pillaging revealed a mercenary ethic where profit overwhelmed any code. In one era, knights symbolized ideals. In the other, they remained vulnerable to base motives. Yet these knights all navigated the same social structures: feudal obligations, training as squires, and pressures to maintain retinues. Their choices highlighted the fragility of chivalric ideals when tested by ambition, hunger, or ideological zeal. Consider how family ties influenced decisions. Marshall negotiated his father's life by pleading with Henry II. Raoul's vendetta ignited when his uncle's lands passed to a rival. In one era, blood bonds fostered unity. In the other, they fueled internecine slaughter. Similarly, faith played a dual role. Douglas framed his crusading vow as Christian piety. Mercator used religious fervor as cover for mercenarism. At Clisson in 1172, a monk recorded how Douglas freed Saracen prisoners whose ransom exceeded necessities, citing Christian charity. Meanwhile, Mercator's men justified killing fellow Christians in Greece as a divine mandate to secure wages. In one era, faith inspired mercy. In the other, it masked avarice and cruelty. Tournaments and sieges offered different litmus tests. Marshall found redemption in courtly triumphs and pious generosity, using ransoms to fund religious foundations. He treated detainees with respect and paraded them before audiences, extracting ransoms yet ensuring their safe return. Conversely, Mercator used tournaments as ruses, slaughtering opponents off the lists rather than facing ransom obligations. Sheridan of Anjou, yet another knight, reportedly paid for tournaments where Spartan champions faced straw effigies rather than worthy foes. In one era, fair play defined honor. In the other, deception became a knight's tactic. Psychological scars also bound these knights. Marshall's grandson wrote of his grandsire's nightmares. Visions of men's remained stuck in his boots long after blood seeped into the leather. Raoul de Cambrai, according to some chroniclers, suffered fits of rage at night, crying out over phantoms of his victims. Douglas, reportedly, saw no ghosts but felt waves of remorse when recalling the captives' pleas he once spared. Mercator, oddly, showed no remorse on record. His fame rose not as a knight but as a cautionary tale of mercenary ferocity. In one era, knights carried glory. In the other, they bore the invisible chains of guilt and memory. With so many paths diverging from a common origin, stories of knighthood, what can we learn? First, codes only guide if a knight chooses to follow them. Marshall had every reason to imitate Raoul's ruthlessness to secure lands. Instead, he balanced mercy with might. Douglas had power to plunder. Instead, he honored chivalric restraint. Conversely, Raoul embraced vengeance, and Mercator strapped on armor for profit, ignoring any vestige of chivalry. Personal choice, shaped by social pressures but not determined by them, defined each knight's legacy. Let's reflect on a brief lesson. In any discipline, medicine, law, business, codes of ethics set aspirational standards, yet individuals decide how strictly to follow them. A surgeon might heal countless patients but also impose needless procedures for profit. A lawyer might champion justice but exploit loopholes for personal gain. Like medieval knights, modern professionals navigate systemic pressures. Economic incentives, organizational loyalties, personal ambition. Recognizing that ethical codes matter most when tested encourages us to champion accountability, mentorship, and transparent oversight. In one era, knights balanced honor with expedience. In the other, they drifted into villainy. As we move forward, our next stop brings us to the intersection of faith and warfare. Crusader Chronicles. Faith, violence, and cultural exchange. There, we'll trace the journey of knights who took the cross, marching across Europe to the Holy Land, and discover how their experiences reshaped both Christian and Muslim worlds. We'll explore how faith inspired valor, how hardship bred brutality, and how encounters along the way sparked cultural and technological exchange. In one era, crusading knights marched for spiritual redemption. In the other, they lived through waterless deserts, hostile sieges, and moral quandaries that forever altered their identities. From knightly legends and atrocities on European fields, we now venture into that crucible of faith and warfare that forged medieval history for centuries to come. For many European knights, the call to crusade offered a divine mandate, a chance to prove piety, earn heavenly reward, and achieve renown on distant fields. In one era, crossing the Mediterranean meant answering the Pope's summons to free the Holy Land. In the other, it meant marching into a world of scorching deserts, unfamiliar foes, and moral ambiguity. The Crusades, spanning from 1096 to 1291, stand as a defining chapter in medieval history, where faith-inspired heroes yet unleashed unprecedented violence, and where East-West encounters sparked deep cultural exchanges. Let's delve into the chronicles of Crusader knights, their motivations, the brutal realities they confronted, and the unintended bridges they built between civilizations. Early crusading overtures hinged on a simple promise. Pope Urban II's 1095 proclamation at Clermont offered plenary indulgence, remission of sins, for anyone who took up arms to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. Thousands heeded that call. Men like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and countless lesser nobles and their retinues. For a young knight in late 11th century France, this represented the ultimate quest, a chance to demonstrate unwavering devotion while securing land and prestige. Yet upon embarking, many found themselves ill-prepared. Armored for European winters, they struggled through summer heat in Italy, ran out of food crossing the Balkans, and faced Turkish archers who harried them at every ford. In one era, crusading knights envisioned holier warfare. In the other, they met logistical nightmares that drained morale before the first battle. Take Reginald of Acon, a minor knight from Brittany, whose dreams of holy glory quickly evaporated under Anatolian sun. Chroniclers note that after crossing Byzantine territory, Reginald's contingent reached Nicaea exhausted. Their destriers, starved for water, collapsed under midday heat. Knights walked miles in full armor to fetch meager springs, careful to avoid Turkish ambushes. By the time they reached the walls of Nicaea in June 1097, dysentery and dehydration had already felled nearly a third of their force. When Byzantine soldiers finally guided them safely inside the city, Reginald was so weakened that he could barely lift his sword. In one era, crusaders believed divine providence would sustain them. In the other, they learned that faith alone could not conquer thirst and exhaustion. Siege warfare re-emerged as a central feature in the Crusader states. At Antioch, 1098, after a grueling 8-month blockade, Christian knights endured famine, pestilence, and internal discord, only to discover that their Muslim counterparts faced similar hardships. Medieval sources recount how crusaders ate mules, and on a few harrowing occasions, resorted to cannibalism of fallen foes. Knights who once practiced chivalric courtesy in Europe now found themselves bargaining with Turkish emirs over terms of surrender, offering ransom while withholding mercy to stave starvation. In one era, Antioch's Christian defenders saw themselves as righteous soldiers of God. In the other, they became desperate survivors in a deadly charnel house. Even after entering Jerusalem in July 1099, Crusaders confronted staggering violence. Chronicler Raymond of Aguilers wrote that the streets ran red with blood, the earth was slick with gore. Knights under Godfrey of Bouillon's banner slaughtered thousands of inhabitants. Muslims, Jews, and even some Eastern Christian groups perceived as complicits. In one era, capturing Jerusalem meant fulfilling a sacred vow. In the other, it meant crossing a line that stained chivalric ideals with mass slaughter. The tension between spiritual aspiration and brutal conquest defined the Crusades as much as any theological rationale. Yet while faith motivated many to draw swords, it also paved the way for cross-cultural exchange. In Outremer, the collective name for crusader states in Syria and Palestine. Knights encountered Arabic medical texts, learned to drink sweetened coffee, and admired Islamic architecture. Hospitaller knights, initially tending to wounded pilgrims, soon adopted Arabic surgical techniques refined by Muslim physicians like Ibn al-Nafis. One account describes Brother Otho of Flanders treating his own chronic dysentery using a concoction derived from Arabic herb guides he translated. In one era, knights came to fight infidels. In the other, they absorbed knowledge that would later spark European renaissances in medicine and science. Conversely, Muslims encountered Western innovations too: heavy cavalry armor, stirrups, and certain siege engines. During the Siege of Tripoli, 1102 to 1109, the Crusaders deployed advanced counterweight trebuchets learned from Byzantine engineers, delivering deadly projectiles far beyond the range of earlier torsion engines. Muslim chroniclers marveled at these machines, recording how stones the size of a man flew as if hurled by giants. In one era, Crusaders sought to dominate by force. In the other, they became unwitting teachers of technology to sultanates such as the Zengids and Fatimids. The Fifth Crusade, 1217 to 1221, exemplifies both the promise of exchange and the pitfall of miscalculation. Led by King Andrew II of Hungary and Duke Leopold VI of Austria, Crusader armies invaded Egypt, recognizing that controlling the Nile Delta might isolate Jerusalem. They built massive wooden siege towers and used Venetian ships to navigate the Nile. Initially, they captured the fortress at Damietta in 1219, raising hopes, yet supply lines stretched thin. Defenders cut the sluice gates, flooding camps, and disease spread through stagnant waters. Knights found themselves stranded under the searing Egyptian sun, waiting for reinforcements that never came. Ultimately, they capitulated, surrendering Damietta and returning home in disgrace. In one era, Crusaders believed they could conquer Egypt as a Christian crusader state. In the other, they discovered that local climate, engineering acumen, and Islamic logistics outpaced their own. Amid these battles, individuals navigated moral complexities. Take Sir John de Grailly, a Gascon knight who arrived around Acre just as plague ravaged the city in 1291. Instead of retreating to comfort in his cell, he tended to suffering commoners, using his own rations to prevent starvation. Later, as Mamluk forces closed in, he chose to break through the Egyptian lines rather than surrender, knowing his ransom would never arrive. Chroniclers recount how he rode toward a Turkish camp, unarmed save for his simple sword, calling out to his comrades as he fell beneath a volley of arrows. In one era, de Grailly personified faith-driven sacrifice. In the other, he became martyr fodder for Mamluk propaganda. On a broader scale, trade flourished amid this turmoil. Venetian and Genoese merchants secured lucrative concessions from both Crusader kings and Muslim emirs, establishing trading posts in Tyre, Acre, and Alexandria. Silks, spices, and ivory from Asia traveled along routes that knights once rode. A Venetian envoy, Marco Polo's uncle, Niccolo, recounts in letters how his convoy found itself sold ransoms of Armenian captives one day and bartered pearls in Syrian markets the next. In one era, knights marched to war. In the other, they protected burgeoning merchant fleets that would reshape global commerce. Yet these merchants wielded influence that sometimes challenged knightly authority. The Genoese at Acre financed castle fortifications, funded mercenary defenses, and even fielded their own warships. Knights who once commanded obedience from villains now depended on Genoese silver to pay soldiers. Tensions flared when Genoese captains refused to supply naval support unless granted extra port privileges. In one era, crusading knights held all the power. In the other, armed merchants dictated terms that shaped political landscapes. Another dimension, religious zeal often cloaked acts of sheer opportunism. On the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, Richard the Lionheart's troops massacred hundreds of Jewish communities in Germany en route, an atrocity that went unpunished by the king, despite Richard's reputation as a chivalric hero. In Jerusalem itself, truces with Saladin were breached as mercenary contingents pursued hostages for ransom. While Richard and Saladin exchanged courtly gifts, Richard sending snow to cool Saladin's fever, soldiers pillaged Christian churches in Acre at night, looking for looted treasures. In one era, chivalric kings negotiated honorably. In the other, their armies acted as fractured, unaccountable forces. As Crusader states declined, Acre fell in 1291, Tripoli in 1289. Many Europeans returned home, bringing back memories, artifacts, and stories that reshaped their homelands. One beloved example, Maria of Antioch, born during her father's brief rule of the principality, later became Empress of the Latin Empire in Constantinople. Her shifting allegiances, marrying Baldwin II of Constantinople, then fleeing when Byzantine forces recaptured the city, highlight how Crusader offspring embodied both Eastern and Western influences in their faith, dress, and politics. In one era, nobles sought to forge dynasties in the East. In the other, those dynasties collapsed, scattering their legacies across Europe. Meanwhile, in Europe, illuminated manuscripts featured stylized Arabic script, reflecting new aesthetic tastes. The Toledo School of Translators in Spain became a hub for translating Aristotle, Avicenna, and Alhazen from Arabic into Latin, fueling the rise of universities in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. Knights who once reigned destriers along the road to Jerusalem returned to find their castles adorned with Moorish tiles, and clerics debating natural philosophy drawn from Arabic texts. In one era, crusading knights believed they would return to an unchanging Christendom. In the other, they encountered a transformed intellectual landscape enriched by Islamic scholarship. Of course, not every knight returned. Many perished or settled permanently. Some converted to Islam or married local nobility, forging hybrid identities. The true story of El Cid, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, straddles both eras' lines. Although active in the 11th century, before the First Crusade, his legacy foreshadowed Crusader patterns. Serving both Christian and Muslim lords, he commanded mixed forces in Valencia, blending tactics and values from both faiths. After his death, Castilian poets immortalized him as paragon of knighthood without distortion. Yet this legend obscures his pragmatic alliances with Moorish rulers, a testament that, even earlier, knights navigated dual worlds. While El Cid predated formal crusading, his life underscores how Spanish knights fused religious ardor with cultural exchange, anticipating patterns that would flourish during the Crusades proper. As Crusader knights bowed before caliph and pope alike, many grappled with moral dissonance. Sir Ralph de Rivolx, returning from a later crusade in 1270, wrote in his diary that the enmity of faith so often cloaked greed. I found men less guided by holiness than by the promise of booty. At home, he worked to fund local monasteries, gifts that might atone for his violent deeds overseas. In one era, knights believed crusading sanctified their actions. In the other, they bore guilt over communities slaughtered under holy banners. By the mid-170th century, the rise of professional standing armies sealed the knights' obsolescence. Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, leading Protestant forces in the 30 Years' War, innovated lean and mobile infantry tactics, battalions of musketeers supported by lighter cavalry. At the Battle of Breitenfeld, 1631, his well-drilled musketeers and artillery overcame the Spanish Habsburg forces, including aristocratic cavalry, with ease. Chroniclers from both sides noted that steel breastplates flashed in vain against the thunder of Swedish guns. In one era, the knight's charge was the shock attack. In the other, disciplined lines of shot and massed cannon fire defined victory. Culturally, the image of the knight as romantic hero persisted, albeit in literature and art rather than on the battlefield. The publication of Don Quixote, 1605-1615, by Miguel de Cervantes captures this tension. A minor nobleman dons an antiquated suit of armor to revive chivalric ideals, only to be defeated by mundane reality. Through Quixote's misadventures, tilting at windmills and fighting flocks of sheep, the novel satirizes the nostalgism for a knightly world already decades past. In one era, chivalry guided real fights. In the other, it provided fodder for comical critique. Even monarchs who valued knightly traditions adapted to modern warfare. Henry VIII of England, knighted himself, commissioned the King's Book of 1543 to codify chivalric ethics. Yet he invested heavily in garrisons, maritime artillery, and professional infantry. By the time of the Spanish Armada, 1588, his successors deployed coastal cannons and organized, trained bands, local militias, rather than feudal levies. In one era, knighthood offered direct access to royal favor. In the other, knights needed to navigate bureaucratic channels and compete with professional officers for influence. Let's draw a brief lesson from these transformations. Every generation clings to best practices, only to see them eclipsed by innovation. In business, a company may dominate its industry offering a flagship product, like Nokia with cell phones, only to be overtaken by shifts to smartphones. Similarly, medieval knights embodied elite military practice until gunpowder and professionalization redefined success. Recognizing that change can render long-standing institutions obsolete encourages continuous learning, adaptability, and humility. In one era, knights embodied martial mastery. In the other, they needed to embrace new tactics or fade into history. As we prepare to leave the era of battlefields and the twilight of heavy cavalry, it's clear that the knight's final chapters unfolded amid social centralization, economic pressures, and military innovation. Yet while their practical role faded, their symbolic power endured. Romantic authors like Sir Walter Scott and Tennyson resurrected knights in verse and prose, kindling a nostalgic flame that reverberates today in literature and film. We still see echoes of knightly codes in modern notions of service, honor, and leadership. Whether in military academies adopting knightly mottos or in companies branding themselves with heraldic imagery. Our next and final section, Reflections and Legacies. The Knight in Memory and Modern Culture, will examine how the knight story continues to shape our collective imagination. We'll explore how films, novels, and reenactments keep chivalric ideals alive, even as we remain mindful of historical complexity. In one era, knights donned armor to fight for feudal lords. In the other, we don cosplay to celebrate ideals of service and valor. Though the knight's tactical relevance may have ended, his legacy endures in the stories we tell and the values we cherish. As steel gives way to digital swords and modern myths, we remember that the knight's true power lay in inspiring us, both with the promise of honor and the cautionary tales of hubris. Today, when we invoke the image of a knight, we often think not of chainmail and lances but of ideals, courage, honor, and selflessness. In one era, knights charged across muddy fields at the sound of trumpets. In the other, they ride through our imaginations in books, films, and even in ethical codes. Their legacy permeates modern American values, shaping how we view service, heroism, and civic responsibility. As we explore this enduring influence, we'll see how a medieval warrior class became a timeless symbol in our culture, inspiring everything from youth character programs to blockbusters on the big screen. From the early days of settlement, American colonists brought with them European narratives of chivalry. By the 18th century, founding fathers admired classical and medieval models of virtue. Benjamin Franklin famously promoted acts of courtesy and humility, echoing chivalric tenets. Washington's farewell address urged Americans to cultivate temperance, frugality, and benevolence, qualities reminiscent of chivalric virtue. In one era, knights embodied these traits on horseback. In the other, political leaders championed them as citizens' obligations. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, the romantic vision of knighthood flourished in American literature. Walter Scott's Ivanhoe and Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court introduced generations to Camelot's chivalric code. Young readers learned that honor meant protecting the weak and loyalty meant standing by one's friends. When Frederick Remington's illustrations of mounted cavalrymen reached newspapers, civilians saw echoes of medieval knights in U.S. cavalry uniform, the same elements of discipline and rough-hewn valor. In one era, knights defended castles. In the other, American soldiers trotted on ponies at frontier forts, bridging medieval ethos with new frontier realities. In contemporary America, the Boy Scouts of America explicitly reference knighthood in their rank of First Class, Star, and Life, culminating in the Eagle Scout Award, often compared to the medieval knighting ceremony. Court of Honor ceremonies feature flags, torches, and the Eagle Scouts promise to uphold the Scout Oath, a modern echo of a knight's vow. Scouts learned trustworthiness, loyalty, and helpfulness, values that mirror chivalric ideals. In one era, a squire knelt before his lord for the accolade. In the other, a scout stands before his troop to receive a medal, pledging service to community and country. The U.S. military also draws on knightly symbolism. West Point's motto, duty, honor, country, resonates with chivalric concepts. Cadets wear ceremonial swords at graduations, harking back to medieval practices. During the annual ring weekend, 4th class cadets receive class rings featuring the old Army crest, a Parthenon flag with an American bald eagle, reminding them that they join a brotherhood akin to knightly orders. Likewise, naval academies use the officer's charge, embodying service and sacrifice reminiscent of a knight's oath to protect. In one era, a knight clasped a sword to signify his fealty. In the other, a new officer's sword and oath pledge fidelity to Constitution and fellow service members. Beyond formal organizations, American popular culture celebrates knights through film and television. The Star Wars franchise, for example, overtly labels its heroes as Jedi Knights, blending medieval symbolism with futuristic settings. Luke Skywalker's lightsaber duels echo sword fights. Jedi codes mirror chivalric creeds, emphasizing self-restraint and protection of the innocent. When audiences cheered as Luke confronted Darth Vader, they tapped into the same emotional current that moved crowds at medieval tournaments. The triumph of virtue over ability. In one era, a knight brandished a broadsword. In the other, a Jedi ignited a glowing crystal saber. Movie franchises like The Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones further popularized chivalric tropes. Aragorn's knightly bearing, Lancelot's tragic quest, and Jon Snow's watchful responsibility as part of the Night's Watch all reflect medieval codes of honor. Audiences sympathize with characters who struggle to balance personal desires with loyalty to their lords, a dilemma every 18th century knight confronted at feudal muster. When Samwise Gamgee urges Frodo to press on for the good of the Shire, he echoes a knight's call to service. In one era, knights answer to chieftains. In the other, modern heroes answer to higher causes: liberty, justice, fraternity. In sports, the notion of sportsmanship often invokes knightly ideals. College football rivalries adopt names: the Iron Bowl, the game, where players chase not just victory, but respect for opponents. When athletes shake hands after fierce competition, they ritualize a modern chivalric gesture, acknowledging worth in the vanquished. The Heisman Trophy's bronze poses a running back mid-stride, reminiscent of a mounted knight in full charge, speed, power, and grace combined. In one era, the tilt barrier measured a knight's skill. In the other, the scoreboard measures an athlete's prowess, both demanding discipline, courage, and respect for rules. Civic ceremonies also draw on the knightly past. Presidential inaugurations feature troops in ceremonial armor, like the U.S. Marine Corps Silent Drill Platoon, their rifles poised in choreographed precision, evoking medieval knights preparing for pageantry rather than war. White House social aides, civilians serving state dinners, uphold protocols akin to a medieval court, greeting dignitaries, ensuring proper etiquette, and symbolizing national hospitality. When a president awards the Congressional Medal of Honor, the honoree kneels as a medal is clasped, an echo of ceremonial accolade. In one era, a knight knelt before his liege to receive a spurs and sword. In the other, a soldier kneels before civilian leadership to receive a medal for valor. Even in fashion, chivalric touches endure. The wedding vow, to have and to hold, conjures images of a knight pledging to protect his lady. Grooms often don tuxedos with a single white rose or red boutonniere, colors and designs with roots in medieval heraldry, where a knight's crest conveyed lineage and loyalty. Some couples incorporate swords in their ceremonies. The exchanging of rings over a ceremonial sword, a practice drawn from knighting rituals that symbolize transition into a new social role. In one era, a knight's vow bound him to his liege and lady. In the other, couples vow lifelong fidelity under modern arches and altars. Consider the realm of charitable works. Knights Hospitallers' legacy, founding hospitals and caring for pilgrims, finds echoes in modern philanthropic orders. The Knights of Columbus, a Catholic fraternal organization founded in 1882 to provide financial aid to the sick and widowed. Their programs scholarship foundations, disaster relief, community service, mirror the medieval order's priorities. Faith, defense of the church, and care for the vulnerable. Members meet in councils, where regalia reminiscent of knights' cloaks, and pledge to uphold moral and social welfare. In one era, knights waged hospital work under church auspices. In the other, they continue that mission in tie and feathered chapeau. Volunteers at Renaissance fairs offer another living history example. In towns across America, enthusiasts don padded gambesons, chainmail shirts, and helm replicas to reenact medieval tournaments and battles. At the Maryland Renaissance Festival, knight squires instruct children in sword drills with wooden foils, emphasizing safety, mutual respect, and fun. These events raise funds for local charities, blending entertainment with civic engagement. In one era, youths apprenticed as squires under stern masters. In the other, they learn courtesy and teamwork under the guidance of costumed volunteers. Literature courses in universities examine chivalry's influence on modern ethics. Freshman seminars may compare Chaucer's The Knight's Tale with modern superhero mythologies, prompting discussions about duty and sacrifice. Law schools analyze the code of chivalry alongside professional codes of ethics, bar association canons, and medical Hippocratic oaths, debating whether loyalty to clients supersedes loyalty to higher moral principles. In one era, a knight's breach of oath tarnished his honor. In the other, lawyers and doctors confront similar dilemmas. Do we serve principal or client? On a personal level, many Americans adopt knightly values in everyday life, mentoring youth, volunteering at food banks, or teaching newcomers the ropes at workplaces. Coaching youth sports, adults often emphasize play fair, respect opponents, and lead by example rather than winning at all costs. The popular golden rule, treat others as you wish to be treated, mirrors chivalric admonitions to protect the weak and defend the innocent. In one era, knights defended villagers. In the other, neighbors helped neighbors, sustaining communities with acts of kindness. Despite this pervasive influence, simplistic romanticization can obscure history's complexities. When children learn that knights always saved damsels and never pillaged peasants, they risked internalizing sanitized myths rather than understanding real human struggles. Educators combat this by teaching nuanced history, showing that some knights were oppressors while others were peacemakers, that code chivalry worked imperfectly shaped by context. In one era, knights personified ideals and flaws. In the other, we must balance admiration with critical awareness. Before we look ahead, let's draw a short lesson. All societies craft heroes, figures embodying ideals. But no hero transcends complexity. Like knights who combined valor with brutality, modern icons, whether celebrities, athletes, or leaders, blend admirable traits with real-world imperfections. Acknowledging both aspects allows us to maintain inspiration without deceptive hagiography. In one era, knights served as moral exemplars. In the other, we learn that ideals guide us best when tempered by realism. As we conclude our exploration of knights' influence on American values and culture, consider how their dual legacy, a blend of noble aspiration and human fallibility, mirrors our own society. In inspired moments, we rise to defend the vulnerable, volunteer for causes greater than ourselves, and debate ethics in ways that recall chivalric councils under torchlight. In less savory times, we wrestle with power's temptations, compromise ideals, or ignore the vulnerable around us. The knight's story reminds us that valor must be continually earned and virtues vigilantly upheld. If these reflections have resonated, perhaps you'll explore opportunities to enact knightly values in your community, mentoring a student, championing social justice, or simply standing for what is right, even when it is hard. We've journeyed from medieval fields to modern classrooms, from chainmail to corporate boardrooms, discovering that the knight's code remains alive in everyday choices. As we close, remember, the knight's greatest legacy is not remembered in armor, but in acts of courageous compassion that transcend time and place.